Let me tell you about the environment a little bit. Uh, Being raised in the South, and the South would be considered from Mason-Dixon line down, and of course we're segregated from birth to death. If you were lucky enough to be born in a hospital, it was probably a hospital where they had a what they call a colored section or Negro section, and there were little or no medical doctors that would treat you, so that female mother's mortality, baby's mortality was pretty big at that time. I was born in a family. My father was a minister, and my mom had been a teacher. And so once she started having a family, then she stopped teaching. So there were five of us. I had four brothers. I was the next to the last, and I was the only girl. I think I was treated more strictly than my brothers were, primarily because I was a girl, and then also it was just normal for that time period for girls to be treated as though you were supposed to just be the light of the family, and the boys were expected to do the outside work. The girls were expected to be on the inside. Of course, the good stuff was happening on the outside, because my brothers were out there with the cattle, and they were doing these fun things, and mom and me were in the house doing washing, cooking, and laundry, which I hated. And but at any rate, as it happened, I was a good student and was relatively smart, because my mom taught all of us to read and write before we went to school, her being a former teacher. And one of the things that would happen as I was growing up, you could not help but notice we were walking to school, and the white kids were riding to school on buses. And as they were riding to school, they would sometimes be throwing things out of the windows at us as we were walking. And the other thing that happened too, we were getting the books from the white students, from what the white students had. And of course, by the time we got them, they were out of date. And but that's what happened to us. So whatever we got was already late by the time we got it. But one of the things that my parents wanted to be sure to happen, that we were educated as much and as well as possible. Where I was growing up, there was no high school for African American students. Once you finished 8th grade, if your family did not pay for you to stay in a town close by that had a high school, then everybody quit school at 8th grade. So that was a part of the life as well. In a small town that I grew up in, it was so small they couldn't afford to do much segregation, because it was just too poor. And we had a cousin a black guy who owned a store in the downtown Walnut Cove, North Carolina, which was big because he was the only black person that had a store. And so he sold things like magazines and candies and that kind of thing. So it was not a big thing, but in today's, as we look at it today, but it was a big thing for that time period, because there was nobody else that had that. And of course, we had our own beauty shops and barber shops. The big thing was having a barber shop, beauty shop, because that's where everybody met to say hello and to greet each other. We grew up going to church every Sunday. And of course, it was my father being pastor. At that point, we were living just down the street from where the church was, in the church parsonage. Now, this wonderful parsonage that was provided for my father had 2 bedrooms, a dining room, and a kitchen, and a bathroom. Now, but you see, there was no central heat. The house was a big pot-bellied stove in the living room. And so you had to keep those doors open so that when that heat was going on, that the bedrooms were heated. So all of my brothers slept in one bedroom, and my parents and me were in the next bedroom. It was in the other bedroom. One of the things I remember us doing, my father sang, and my mother sang. My father was a tenor, my mother was an alto, and all of us learned to sing because we were in the church choir. My mother was in the choir, and of course my brothers and all learned music. And I had a next door neighbor who was the church pianist. And so my mom insisted that I learn how to play the piano. And so I did. Those piano lessons for years until we moved from there. Then when we moved someplace else, my father knew another music teacher that he'd gone to school with. And so she taught me piano as well. And because I was able to play the piano, I was accompanist for the high school. And I was only 10 or 11 years old at that time. But I was the only one that knew music well enough to be able to play for the high school choir. So it caused me to be able to travel around in circles that I would not have ordinarily been able to travel in. So, and my parents did the best they could to try to provide experiences for us that were uplifting and cultural. And so, but playing the piano caused us to be able to travel. So whenever we travel someplace, you got to see things, got to meet people, and expand your horizon in ways that you would not ordinarily be able to do that. So playing the piano helped me to learn to do that. When I got to college, I was pianist for the women's choir and for the chorale society, and so it was a fabulous experience. I was working at Winston-Salem State. What was going on then was the civil rights movement started, and Dr. Martin Luther King was going around the country preaching and teaching all this kind of thing. One of the things that he taught was how to be passive in the midst of violence. And of course, he went through to churches, and had people come in, and he would teach them, hey, look, here's what we have to do. Now, if you think you cannot do this, you cannot be out on the street, because there's more of them than it is of us. And they have the guns and the weapons. And he says, love, we have to show love, because love will overcome violence. And so this is what he taught. And as he was going around to colleges and universities teaching this kind of thing, I was a member of the choir at Shaw University. And he came to Shaw University to give a speech. And I was in the choir at that time. And I remember the song we sang before he spoke was Fight the Good Fight. It's a hymn of the church, Fight the Good Fight with all thy might. And I was close enough to be able to touch him. He was, when you see him, snippets of him speaking, it was nothing like being in his presence. He was electrifying. He was able to speak without notes. He could do it for an hour if he wanted to, but he commanded attention, and he got that. And of course, it was just a marvelous experience. Now, the other thing that was happening while after that phase was going on were the sit-ins. And this is how my husband and Jesse Jackson came into play. Of course, Jesse Jackson was at A&T at the time. My husband was there at A&T as well. And so Jesse and students there decided they were not going to move from the counters at Woolworths, because Woolworths was a main 5 and 10 cent store, and everybody shopped at Woolworths. As students decided they were not going to get up from the counters; they would sit at the counters until they were served. Of course, they got ketchup thrown on them, and some of them got coffee spilled on them, all those kinds of things. And of course, there was this big thing with the police coming to arrest. But at the time, what happened was students were free to do certain kinds of things that the parents couldn't do. We began to catch on that, so the kids were sitting in student account, having sit-ins. Others were going to try to register to vote and trying to get into courthouses and this kind of stuff. So there were massive jailings of students. And at that time, I was teaching at Winston-Salem State. And what they were doing with students was, as the students were sitting in, they were arresting the students, and they ran out of jail spaces. So what they did then was put the students in the baseball field. Of course, we were raising money for food and for sanitary products, all kinds of stuff, because That's where students were kept until the crisis was over for them. But what it then did was there again, these were the times when there was a white fountain, and then there were color fountains. You had to sit in the back of the bus if you were a person of color. Here, the students decided they were not going to move when they got to Washington. They were not going to move to the back of the train. So what they did, it stopped the railroad tracks. They stopped because they refused to allow these students to. They had to put on new cars because the students wouldn't move. So that was the kind of thing that we went through. And one of the things that one of the reasons why the students were doing that, because we were encouraging that, was because we wanted to have equal rights. So today, you don't have to worry about that because somebody else did that. But once Pastor Cooley took the pastorate of First Baptist, and of course we ran into Dr. Leach. And while he was there, one of the things I did was play the piano, and he played the organ. Sometimes we would do really interesting stuff while he was the musician here, and I can remember there were times when we would do these intricate pieces, and people would stand and applaud, and that was really fun. And really, it was a work of art almost every Sunday morning. And it was really wonderful because at that time the choir was a massive choir. The Youth Baptist Choir of Stilton was the choir to be reckoned with, and it was just wonderful. Of course, Mrs. King, she was the one that had started developing that, and he came right after her. So there was already a great foundation for him to build on. But that was a wonderful experience. And of course, as time passed. And then I had the stroke in 1988, and that ended that part of my life. And after I had stroke, it was one of those kinds of situations where it was really a crossroads, and it was a time of faith testing, because people say, "You're a minister's wife. Why would you have a stroke?" And I was saying to myself sometimes too, why would I have a stroke? I was trying to figure out, okay, now who am I since this happened to me? Another wonderful thing that happened with First Baptist members, and I will never forget this, and will always be grateful. The deaconess from the church would come by in the mornings to help me get dressed for the day, and the deacons would drive me back and forth to therapy so that I could get that done. And within about 6 months after I had the surgery, I was able to go back to work. My workplace said, "You can't come back to work without a doctor's notice." So he says to me, "How are you going to go back to work? Your arms don't work and your leg doesn't work." I said, "Well, I don't work with my arm and leg. I have to work with my mind." So he said, "Well, you're going to have to have an evaluation from a psychologist." I said, "Okay, well, set it up." What was discovered during that 3-hour evaluation was that I did have short-term memory loss, but my long-term and middle memory were excellent. None of that was bothered. So within about 6 months, I was back at work. Now, the grace of God, I give God all the glory and all the credit for this, because it did not have to be. There were people in our own church who had strokes after I did and passed away. So I am grateful to God for how He allowed me to go to do this. I'm grateful because of the experiences that I have had, and I'm grateful because I just feel that First Baptist members were thoughtful and kind to me when I was not able to do very much at the time, and so I'm just a grateful person. It was one of the most uplifting things that I have ever experienced, which I thought I would never experience in my lifetime. And it's even more amazing to see how more popular they have become even out of office, and the kinds of things that they're doing to continue to be examples to our public, not only for African American people, but for all people. So I think it's a marvelous thing, and I think it's just a stepping stone for what can happen in our country. Don't give up. Study hard so that you're not coming off sounding ignorant. Learn good English. Learn how to address people, and have good skills for whatever job you're going for, so that there's no one that can say that you're not qualified for that job. I think that would be my takeaway.